Welcome to another video from ExplainingComputers.com. This time we're going to look at the latest version of the Debian Linux distro. In addition to being a popular distro in its own right, Debian is also the base for many other distros. So, for example, MX Linux, Deepin, Raspberry Pi OS and Ubuntu are all based on Debian. And in turn, Zorin OS and Linux Mint are based on Ubuntu, although there's also a direct Debian edition of Linux Mint. And all of this means that the release of a new version of Debian is an important milestone for the Linux community. So, let's go and take a closer look. So, it's June the 10th, 2023, and Debian 12 has just been released. Like previous editions, it's named after a character from Toy Story, and specifically after a little green worm that likes books. It's great to see that Debian 12 will be supported for 5 years. And if we scroll on down, we find there's official support for 9 architectures, including 64-bit and 32-bit x86 and ARM CPUs, if, with very old 32-bit x86 systems, no longer supported. To get Debian 12, let's go to the home page, and then here we will scroll on down to a download like that, where immediately we're presented with a link for a 64-bit ISO for installing Debian 12 on a standard x86 computer with an internet connection. However, for other versions, including live images that can be tried before installation, we can scroll on down here and click on Getting Debian. And here we have lots and lots of options. For a start, we can find a 32-bit version of a network installer. We can find cloud images for using Debian 12 on platforms like Amazon Web Services. We can find down here complete installation images that allow installation without a network connection. There are links for buying optical media, and finally there are the live images I just mentioned. So for example, if we click down here, we find torrents for a number of different 64-bit versions of Debian 12, and they differ by having different graphical desktops available: Cinnamon, GNOME, KDE Plasma, etc. Or we can download a version without a desktop. However, what I'm going to do is to go back to the main download page, where I'm going to grab a copy of the 64-bit network installer. This we're going to use to install Debian 12 on my i5 test rig, and we'll be given the option during installation to select our desktop environment. And there we are, the file has downloaded, so let's now use Balena Etcher to write the ISO image to a bootable USB drive. So, we're now booting up from our USB drive, and as this is not a live image, we'll go straight into the installer, as you can see. And I do understand the installer for Debian 12 has been updated. So, let's select Graphical Install like that. And I'll now set my language as English, and my location will be United Kingdom, as will be my keyboard layout. And it's now detecting hardware. And now we need to set a host name for the system. We'll use the default of Debian. And the domain name ending is completely irrelevant for my home setup, but I'll just use .com to keep it happy. Next, it wants us to set a root password, but I'm actually going to leave this blank because, as it explains here, if we do leave it blank, it means I can use the sudo command to execute root commands from the initial user account. So here I'm going to click on Continue, and then I have to set up the initial user account. The name here will be EC, as I always put in. That'll give me a username lowercase EC, and then I have to set a password. And it's now time to set up the disk. I'm going to use the entire disk here for installing the operating system. This is going to be a test install. I've just got one empty SSD connected to my i5 test rig right now. We can see it there, this 120GB Kingston SSD. That is our USB drive below it. So this drive selected OK. We'll click on Continue. And after that, I'm going to select Use all files in one partition. That will be fine. And then here we can just check what's going on. This seems to be OK, so we'll click continue again. It'll probably check again. It has. Is it all right? It is. We'll click yes and continue. And as we can see, the base system is now being installed. Next, we have to configure the package manager. I'm going to leave the main mirror there on UK, which for me is fine. And for the archive mirror, we'll stay on deb.debian.org. Next, I don't need to enter a proxy, so I'll just leave this blank. And we're now asked if we want to supply anonymous information to help the developers, things like that. So I think there I'm going to click yes, and guess what? Continue. So we're now at the exciting part where we pick our desktop environment. The default here is GNOME. I'm going to stick with that for now, although we'll look at some other desktops later in the video. But for now I can just click on continue. And there we are. Our desktop and other software is now being downloaded and installed. And there we go. Installation is now complete. So we can now click on continue to reboot the system. And here we are booting into Debian 12. So I'll just log in. There we go. Looks like everything is working. We're welcome to Debian 12. And there's probably a few extra things to do here. Let's click next on that. And our keyboard seems to be set up OK. We'll click on that. But I'll now turn off location services because why should the computer know where I am? I'm obviously going to skip connecting online accounts, never ever do that. And there we are, we're all done. We can start using our new operating system. This said, I'm now going to make a few scaling changes so things read better on video, and I'll come back to you after that. So, just what's been updated in this latest version of Debian? Well, for a start, we have this lovely new artwork by artist Juliet Tarker, and on a more technical level, Debian 12 is based on Linux kernel 6.1. More broadly, a key update in Debian 12 is that the official ISO images, the installation images, now include non-free firmware, or in other words, proprietary code for controlling certain hardware components. And in my view, this is a massive leap forward, as it means things like Wi-Fi adapters are far more likely to work straight out of the box. And indeed, if we go to activities here and go to software and we go across to the software and updates, we can see we have a new non-free firmware repository. And a repository, if you're not aware, is just where Linux downloads software from. And as we can see, the non-free firmware repository is activated by default. And we can also see that in addition, there are two other repositories for software that are either non-free or which depend on non-free software. And if you're wondering, non-DFSG refers to software that doesn't conform to the Debian free software guidelines. And this doesn't mean software which has to be paid for, it's just that non-DFSG software is not entirely free in the fullest open source meaning of the term. Anyway, without getting too heavily into the philosophy, I would strongly recommend turning on these two repositories, or when it wants my password, of course, to do it. There we go, and we'll turn that one on as well. And then when we hit close, it'll ask us to reload the repository index, which is perfectly reasonable. It wants to know what's gone on. It'll just do that. And this means that the software manager will be able to make use of those non-free software repositories in the future. And indeed, even with some non-free firmware now included, a bit of manual setup is going to be required here in Debian 12 by some users. And we'll look at that in the next segment of the video. But before that, let's take a look at what end-user software is pre-installed. Let's just have a quick look. We can see down here we've got, for example, a Firefox browser. This is actually Firefox ESR, the extended support release, which you might want to replace with a version that's updated a bit more regularly. That's entirely up to you. And also down here we've got LibreOffice Writer. It's hardly a surprise LibreOffice is installed, but there it is. It'll come up as well. That works. Shall we write hello? We always have to write hello, don't we, in these videos? If we don't, we're breaking the law. Let's make hello very large indeed. Yes, there it is. We can use clearly LibreOffice Writer. Do we want to save this? No, we don't. And just to show you what else is pre-installed here, we've obviously got things like the standard file manager. That works perfectly well. Nothing particularly exciting really to report on here. If we look into all the software, lots of things are there. Solitaire's there. That's always good to see, although I'll resist the temptation to play it. and the other things here give us a reasonable range of Linux applications. Talking of Linux, the default desktop here is GNOME. We saw it was the default in the installer, and this is specifically GNOME 43. And as you'll know if you've seen some of my other Linux distro reviews, this is not, shall we say, my favourite desktop environment. But everything here does work as its designers intended, and it is worth noting if we go back to all the software and we go to utilities, they have included a little tweaks application here which allows us to make a few changes, which is what I use to perform a bit of font scaling. Earlier in the video we saw the latest Debian installer doing its stuff. And while some non-free firmware is now included, the installer still lacks the option to install a proprietary driver for an NVIDIA graphics card. So if you've just installed Debian 12 and you've got an NVIDIA GPU like we have on this system here, this really needs taking care of. And do note that the best AMD or Intel GPU drivers will be automatically installed. However, we do here, as I just said, need the NVIDIA driver to make sure we can use things like 3D modeling packages or games or video editors to their full potential. And to install this driver, unlike in other distros, we are forced to go to the terminal. So let's bring up a terminal like that. And I'd note this will only work if you've enabled the non-free repositories like we did in the last segment of the video. But assuming you've done that, we can enter sudo apt install NVIDIA driver. And it'll of course ask for our password. And there we go. We now press Y to continue, and it will install the NVIDIA driver. And there we are, it's done it, although it now tells us there's a conflict with the free driver currently installed. That's hardly a surprise, and we can get around this by rebooting the machine as it says. So we'll do OK like that. And there we are, we should now reboot our system. And here we are back again, and if we do a search for NVIDIA like that, we see we have a NVIDIA settings, so the driver does seem to have been installed OK. This said, I do think it's a shame that in a 2023 distro we had to install it using the terminal. And this kind of thing perhaps explains why quite a lot of people run a desktop distro based on Debian rather than Debian itself. As we've seen, Debian 12 offers many choices of desktop environment, and I've now done a clean install selecting KDE Plasma. Specifically, this is Plasma 5.27, which was released in February 2023 and is the latest version of this very stylish and highly customizable desktop. So let's log in. Here we are, and this is not my first boot. I have been customizing things here quite a bit, which is very easy to do in KDE Plasma, and this is certainly now a desktop environment I'd be very happy to use as my daily driver. Although one thing that's interesting to me is that I did this clean install using exactly the same USB drive we created earlier, with the only difference in the installation being the choice of desktop. However, if we go back to the menu here and we go to graphics, we see that the GNU image manipulation program, GIMP, is pre-installed, and it wasn't pre-installed earlier when we selected the GNOME desktop environment. And this is just a little curious. It doesn't matter, but I didn't expect to get different pre-installed software by selecting a different desktop environment. Anyway, whilst Plasma 5.27 is excellent, there are still many other options. And if you want to install an additional desktop, it's really easy to do. You don't have to do a clean install. You can just go back to System and go to the terminal, here called Console, and enter the command sudo task cell like that. And if we press OK, we can now select different desktop environments. They're all listed here. So for example, we could select LXDE, just press the spacebar to select like that. And LXDE is a good choice on a less powerful system. And in this context, it's worth noting that a Debian 12 system with a graphical desktop can be run on any computer with a dual-core processor and 2 GB of RAM. Anyway, let's actually have a look at LXDE, so I'll tab down to OK. And if we now restart the system, Here we are back on the login screen. And how you switch to a different desktop environment depends on the one you're currently running. There's often a little gear down here on the right which you can select, but here, because we're currently still in KDE Plasma, we go down bottom left and we can select a different desktop. There we can select LXDE. So if we now log in, here we are running an LXDE desktop in Debian 12, which I personally would scale more like this. However, the final desktop I want to try out is Cinnamon. So if we do this, here we are running Debian 12 with a Cinnamon desktop. And I feel very much at home here because the Cinnamon desktop was created by and for Linux Mint. So if I was going to switch to Debian, Cinnamon is probably the desktop that I would choose. Debian 12 is an important release for two reasons. Firstly, as already noted, Debian is the base for many other distros. And secondly, unlike Windows and many other distros, Debian 12 has been released with a 32-bit edition. And this means that older computers with a 32-bit processor will be able to go on running a modern, fully patched operating system for the next 5 years. And I think that's very important indeed. But now that's it for another video. If you've enjoyed what you've seen here, please press that like button. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe, and I hope to talk to you again very soon.